Well, welcome everybody. Sorry about the late start due to our little technical snag. My name is Matthew. Welcome back to the second part of our Sparkle exploration of theory of knowledge and the introduction to that program, what it's going to look like for those of you who are starting it, going into DP1. You may have started this week. If you're in Delhi, I think some of the schools have gone back this week. Over here in Germany, the schools finished this week for their summer break. We're on a slightly different timeline. Some of you will have finished perhaps DP1 and are going into DP2. You've done your TOK exhibition, the first part of the assessment, and we'll be thinking about the essay, which is worth 66% of the final grade for TOK. So what are we going to look at today? Well, let me share my screen with you and take you through the big ideas from today. So we're going to be thinking not really about what we know, but about how we know it and why we're able to say that we are secure in knowing certain things. We are going to be looking at the areas of knowledge. That's the vocabulary that we use in TOK for the subject areas and the families of subject areas. We're going to be looking at the themes that we cover in TOK. These are some of the sort of big external ideas, things like knowledge and technology, knowledge and language, politics, religion. But the biggest element of that is me as a knower and what I bring with me or what other people bring with them to what they know. We're going to be looking at the concepts. This is the vocabulary given to 12 ideas that are, I suppose, nudges to remind us how to look at things and where to look when we make claims about what we know and how we know it. And then we'll finish off by looking at the assessment that we're going to be judged on at the end of our course. So, one of the things I left with last time was asking people to think about something that they had recently learnt in class, something that they now know. And I wanted you to think about how reliable that knowledge is, and how you would actually test it. So I want you to think perhaps about where you were told that, maybe about who told you. Did you read it? Was it in a book? What kind of book was it in? Was it something that you saw on a reel or on a documentary, or did it come up on a feed? Is it something that you saw for yourself, that you got to know yourself? Is it something that you created? Did you actually make your understanding or the thing that you know? Or were you guided to this new knowledge and understanding by somebody else? And was that somebody else a teacher? Was it someone who had planned some learning for you? The point of doing this is to really think about the mechanisms through which we learn things and through which we know things. And there are many of those different mechanisms. There's experiment, there's personal experience. There might be good, reliable mentors through which or from whom I learn things. Certainly, I can't go everywhere to learn things. I can't learn about how ancient Rome worked by going there. I have to do other things. I might have to read and look at other research that people have done. And maybe those people are historians rather than storytellers. And I need to think about how reliable that knowledge is. So if I read something in a book, who published that book? What qualifications did the writers of that book have? We all use textbooks in school, which are immediately out of date when they're printed. Who produces textbooks? In some countries, they're produced by the government. In some countries, they're produced by companies and publishers who are wanting to sell what they're making. Textbooks can be expensive in some parts of the world. I can think of the example of the state biology textbook that's used in Alabama in America, where the biology textbook has an insert inside it that the government puts there, which says that this book contains controversial theories that some scientists use as an explanation for the origin and the evolution of life. That's an interesting way to start a textbook, isn't it? By saying that you might not want to believe what's in here. But in some parts of the world, that is indeed done. So how reliable are our sources of knowledge? That's what you were that's what I asked you to think about. And how would you test that? I mean, it's unrealistic, isn't it, to think that we can actually go and test every single thing that we're learning. But where are we happy to take people's word for it? Where are we happy to read something about it? And where do we actually want to go and do the tests ourselves? And there's a whole career to be made in doing that, isn't there? That's what academic research is, where you're going out and you're doing the work of a mathematician or a scientist or a historian to try and test what we know and see if we can improve it. So I hope that you believe that your teachers are credible sources. They are, after all, qualified. They've studied at universities that are accredited by governments. We have a system of credible academic research. Perhaps as children as well, you learn and understand things from your parents. Are your parents credible sources of knowledge? Do you put them to the test? Part of teenage life is putting your parents to the test, but maybe not on the things that they know. Are they qualified to tell you and teach you? Usually your university or your school teachers have done this thousands of times. Your parents might have done some things once, which is an interesting situation to be growing up in, but that's reality, isn't it? That's how life works, which is also what makes personal experience such a credible tool for learning as well. And we'll come to this later on when we're actually thinking of ourselves as knowers. How did we get to be who we are, and what brought us to the sort of understanding and the biases and the preferences that we actually have? So it's worth just reminding ourselves that whatever we think of is true has to match reality. It has to be consistent with all of the other beliefs that we hold to be true. And it has to fit with this world that's been constructed for us, sometimes through subject areas, sometimes through the cultures and the places that we live, and sometimes with the people who we live through. And I think that it's worth remembering something that Socrates held to be true 2,000 years ago, that an unexamined life is not worth living. The job of what we're doing in TOK is to really think about examining what it is that we know. So, like all things, all subject areas, there's a specialist vocabulary that we have to get used to using. In TOK, we're using the vocabulary of areas of knowledge, AoKs. And there are 5 areas of knowledge that we look at in TOK. The arts. Now, what might that be in school? That might be fine art, visual arts. It could be theatre and drama. It could be dance. It could be as well sort of sculpture, the physical arts. It could be film. That's part of the DP course as well. So the arts are those acts of creation through which we know and learn things about ourselves and others. It could be literature as well. If you think about the languages that you're learning, we can learn language and its form, its grammar, its vocabulary, the way we use it. But then we also use language to create new worlds. My wife is reading Game of Thrones at the moment. That's a completely new world created by George R.R. Martin. It doesn't exist, but we can certainly know things through what we read about the human condition and about each other. We've also got the natural sciences. So I'm a physics teacher originally, trained as a scientist. We've got sciences like biology and chemistry and physics. We also have environmental systems. We might have geology. We might have any science in which we experiment and plan experiments in order to show whether or not our hypothesis is correct. And natural sciences works with objects on which you can repeat experiments. So stones or buggies or single-celled organisms. But the human sciences are a little bit more complicated. That's where we're experimenting on others who have free will, who have preferences and biases, and on whom you can't repeat experiments because once they learn and you have to do things differently or not at all. So the human sciences that we have in the DP program might be geography, they might be economics, business management, anthropology. We could put philosophy in there perhaps, or some elements of philosophy. So there's the human sciences. Mathematics is an area there to itself. And this is the area in which we create an entire system around things which are self-evidently true or axioms. So the idea of geometry, let's say, that Euclid created, two-dimensional geometry, requires us all to share a complete conviction that you can draw a point anywhere and that you can connect 2 points with a straight line and that you can divide that line and you can create a plane and that all right angles are the same and that you can draw a circle at any point of any given radius. And in agreeing that these things are true and self-evident, we can then build and create bigger ideas and theorems. And that's mathematics. And then we've got history as an area of knowledge, which, like mathematics, is a separate subject that we do have in school. Why is it separate? Well, it must be that we work differently in this subject area. You can't experiment in history. There is nothing that is self-evidently true. We're not creating it. We're actually going back and looking at the evidence for it. We're using sources. We're evaluating the reliability of those sources. We might be digging things up. We might be scientific about the way that we do history. Archaeologists certainly try to be scientific. And then we might gather data which allows us to find out what people were eating thousands of years ago. And again, the help of scientists comes in there. But within history itself, we are trying to unearth the evidence to go back and see what happened and why, and what, of course, we can learn from it. So these are the 5 areas of knowledge that we're all learning within on the diploma program and within any other system and any other board exam system. And at universities too, we can categorize, and we love to categorize, any subject that we study into these groups. So what is it that actually makes them what they are? It's the way that we work in them, okay? Which are some of those things that I just mentioned. Now, let's have a look deeper in to see what some of these differences are. And we'll use the example of making a comparison between the sciences and between history. So we're going to think of a situation. Let's imagine, and what I'll ask you to do in a moment is imagine and maybe write some ideas down in the chat. Imagine as a scientist, you have created a new drug which is designed to reduce anxiety. Part of the human condition, seems to be growing. How are you going to find out whether a new drug does actually reduce anxiety? Now, what I'd like you to do for a moment is just to stop and think, use the chat to write some ideas down about what a scientist might do to check whether a drug reduces anxiety. And remember, if you were in the last session, what we're going to be doing in TOK is putting our thoughts into words on paper. That's how we're assessed in writing. And whilst we are very easily convinced that we've thought about things and we know them, it's not until you try and write them down and share it with others that you really do know them. So let's spend a minute having a think. Put some ideas in the chat, please. So we've got some thoughts already. As all good scientists do, they start testing. So let's have a look. Test on animals that previous anxiety-reducing medicines have been tested on. So before you test on humans, you test on animals. You make sure that animals that have a system like ours don't die when you give them a particular medication. Good place to start. So we've got tests, we've got test design, test the drug on human subjects with a history of anxiety. So you'll want to know that people who are anxious feel better when they are taking this drug. Maybe take a test group with a few hundred participants and give them the doses over time. Right, you've got the word dose there. What kind of dose do you start with? You start with different doses and different people, perhaps, and then you observe expected brain activity. You can even use an fMRI scanner and actually watch what's happening to people. You can test their blood. You can look chemically. Testing on human cells, again, making sure that the drug you've invented isn't toxic. So we've got the word experimentation. We've got testing, and we've got the idea that there are people who have anxiety, and perhaps there are people who don't. What happens if you give this medicine to people who are not anxious? Maybe they begin to feel it. So some of the other things that people might come up with here, you've got the elements of control in experimentation. You control the dose, you control the people, you control the sample size, you control the duration, you control the concentrations. Who do you choose? After you've gone through animals and you're testing on humans, where are your humans from? Are there some people who don't experience anxiety who you can test this on? Do we have, communities who have never ever taken any drugs before, where we begin starting on them? All of these things are what medical and pharmaceutical companies and medical researchers are worrying about. Double-blind trials. Do the people administering the drugs know whether it's the real drug or not? We know that there's an effect called the placebo effect, where some people seem to feel better just because you give them sugar. So a double-blind trial makes sure that no one knows what's being given until it gets back to the lab and you match up numbers, and then you're able to test. Does it work for everybody? Is there such a thing as an average person? Medicine is scientific in its approach, but not everyone responds in the same way. Humans are unique, and that makes it complicated. So designing the experiment is a big deal. And then you've got the problem of, is this experiment ethical? Is this experiment legal? There's an awful lot of work that goes in here, but scientists are going to want to work in a way that is systematic, controlled, repeatable. If this drug works over here, will it work over there? So that's the kind of thing that scientists will want to consider. And then you can make predictions on whether something works, and then you put that prediction to the test. Now, let's have a think about the next scenario. Let's imagine that a historian wants to know why Archduke Ferdinand's assassination triggered a world war. How do they go about finding this out? What does certainty look like here? And why can't the historian just run an experiment? What are they actually going to do? Tell me about the historian's approach. Let's take a minute, share ideas in the chat. How's a historian going to work to answer this question? So share any thoughts you've got in the chat. I'll also just ask people in a moment as well if they want to share some ideas. Any students in the room who would like to have some input here? So Snigler shared looking at archives, journals and newspapers and other historical information, and then finding similar points, checking for coherence, newspapers and historical documents. There's probably no one alive who has a good memory of what happened. So it is going to be archives that we're working with. Historical sources that hold one perspective and then viewing other perspectives. Right, we're going to have different perspectives from Croatians, from Austrians, from Germans, from British, from French observers of the situation in Europe at the time. Right, and the emotional aspect of how somebody's assassination changes and affects the way people behave is an interesting one, isn't it? The influence of him on the public. You can't, yeah, absolutely. You can't run an experiment because we can't go back in time. Of course, this is a great source of science fiction thinking and writing. There's so many time travel films and novels based on this idea. Would anyone like to share any ideas? If you want to speak up, unmute yourself and just share anything that you've got. It's also okay if not. Let's look at the last scenario then. Have a think about this one. So, a scenario in the human sciences. So, rather than a medical researcher, we've got a psychologist, someone who studies the way that people's behavior uh, is exhibited. A psychologist who wants to know whether social media increases depression in teenagers. How are they going to find out? What's their work going to look like? How might it be different from a scientist who is working with inanimate objects like a molecule, like drug? And how might it be different from the way that, let's say, a historian works? Again, another minute of thinking. Share your ideas in the chat as well.
Hi, Matthew.
Hi, Snigdha. What are you
Hi.
thinking?
So I was thinking that maybe psychologists could get a group of teenagers, and the first thing they could do is not like exactly like have a talk with them, and maybe try to, and these have to be people who are already very reliant on social media, so then they can talk, observe their reactions, their tendencies on how they approach social media, how they use it, and what are their views on it, and maybe draw some kind of conclusion on how social media is viewed and what are their impacts maybe in their day-to-day life. And then maybe they could also consult some sort of books or on like teenager, adults and well-being, mental health, and also how social media algorithms directly affect it. And but I would think it'd be very hard to be certain about this trend because for a lot of people it could be different depending on how they use it, when they use it. So as a whole, it's hard to tell.
Absolutely, you're right. And there's so many questions out there that come up when you talk about let's get a group of teenagers. Okay, from where? Do we get a group of Amish teenagers who don't use any technology? Well, probably not. Although it would be an interesting experiment, wouldn't it, to give Amish teenagers social media? But then, of course, would they even know how to use? And you know what would that lead to? Um, in many ways, we're already doing this experiment, aren't we, on teenagers? And Jonathan Haidt has written a lot about it in his book, you know, about the teenage mind and about the anxious generation. Yeah, the type of social media use you mentioned that as well. Is it something that we can actually define? Yeah, I use social media. Well, I certainly don't use it in the same way as my 20-year-old daughter, and I certainly don't use it in the same way as my 26-year-old son who stopped using it when he was 20 because of the impact that he realized it was having on what he was learning. Um, Saskia's written here that psychology would study the behavior of teenagers, will look at the present, not at past, as historians do. I mean, it's worth recognizing that, of course, psychologists have been around for a while, probably about 100 years of reasonable psychological research. So you can go back and look at, you know, were teenagers even an interesting subject group back in the day? Perhaps they were not. They weren't treated as adults, and therefore they weren't actually looked at. Behavior can be observed by actions, what types of videos teenagers are making, right? What kind of content? It would be interesting to look at the content creation side of what teenagers do and how they support each other, but also the algorithmic side of what Meta might be doing in order to try and exploit teenagers and to sell their data and to surveil them so that more things can be sold. Um, it's a tricky thing to experiment on any group of people. We can argue that it is being done, but it's almost, I suppose, a survey piece of research, isn't it? Where we're looking at groups, what's happening to them, perhaps what's happened over time. Perhaps we're looking at diagnoses that are being given and made that have changed and increased over time. Um, I'm also just thinking as well about how you even measure anxiety, because that's quite an interesting thing, isn't it? We've been anxious as teenagers for years. I remember as a 17-year-old worrying about what people thought of what I was wearing until I realized that that was absolute nonsense. but it's still part of growing up, that social anxiety. Now we've just got it 24/7 in our pockets, in our bedrooms, which is hard work. But the point here is that a social scientist is going to have to try and design some way of making these measurements and looking at these surveys. A historian is going to have to discover some way of looking at sources, analyzing their credibility, looking at what biases come through these sources. And a scientist is going to have to try and find a way of producing repeatable experiments with sufficient data and reliability to make predictions. The way that these people work determines the nature of what it is that they claim to know. And of course, the nature of how certain we are. Are we certain in science? Are we certain in history? And are we certain in social science? I would argue that we're not certain in any of those things. We'll perhaps recognize that maybe we can be certain in some elements of mathematics, but then we have to assume that the self-evident truths are indeed true. And we may be certain or approaching certainty in the things that we know through art because we feel them. But it's a complicated thing to claim any level of certainty when there's more than one person involved. And of course, that's part of the joy of doing the work with TOK. Now, let's move on and think about the themes that we are looking at in TOK. I mentioned earlier the themes of technology, how that shapes what we know. If you think about science, we've invented amazing machines since inventing the rule for measuring distance. We have entirely new ways of measuring distance across the scale of the universe and across the scale of a molecule. In language, we know and acquire understanding through language. We communicate simply by knowing the language of the other person who's communicating with us. But there's so much more that we communicate with our language, with the subtle differences in meaning and the choice of words that we use that really show where we're from, not only the language that we're speaking, and not just where we might be from, but where we might be from in a society, in a structured class society. I know that my grandparents grew up in the United Kingdom, where you were judged by the quality of your accent. And even until recently, you wouldn't be allowed on the BBC as a newsreader if you didn't speak the same kind of English as the Queen. This is now completely different, but there are some places where the quality of your accent is a judgment that people make. We've also got politics and religion and indigenous societies as themes here. But the biggest theme really is us. Who am I? How did I acquire the way that I think? And what impact does that have on me? Now, starting question to get us to think about that is this one about historians. Would an Indian historian and a British historian write the same account of the independence of India? Would they be wrong to differ? Spend a moment and share some ideas, either in the chat or by speaking, about what might be different. Would it be right to say that people are correct in offering their histories? Perhaps these days it's even interesting to talk about what kind of British historian. You might have a British historian who has grown up entirely post-independence, is entirely ashamed of the colonial past of the country that they grew up in, and utterly believes that reparations need to be made for this disastrous event in history. Statues have been falling all over the United Kingdom that were built by slave traders. My own home city of Bristol, which had the Colston docks in it, now has a docks that doesn't bear the name of Colston. The statue of Colston was pushed into the water by protesters about 10 years ago. The schools named after Colston have been renamed entirely. It's almost as though that period of history will be erased or forgotten. Now, would that be a problem? Because at the moment in Germany, we're facing the rise of a far-right party. Some of the leaders quote Adolf Hitler in their speeches, and it's almost as though people have forgotten what happened here one time. And this, of course, is one of the dangers of ignoring and forgetting your history. I'm just looking at some of the comments here. Hema, it's imperative that differences exist. It's important to realize, isn't it, that difference is a resource. It's a way of helping us think that there may be another way of seeing the world. History is the interpretation of perspectives provided to you. What one reads might be reality for another. No version is entirely accurate. I think that that's always worth and very important to remember. The oppressor would share their struggles. The oppressed would share their journey of struggles. Two entirely different perspectives. Nobody is wrong, but the perspective matters. Do you know, growing up in the United Kingdom and studying some history, I had one understanding of a man called Winston Churchill. Moving to India, I then learnt another understanding of Churchill. And then marrying a person who grew up in Northern Ireland, where he had been the Northern Ireland secretary, I had another perspective of Churchill, who was a complicated person who got his job done. And that's also interesting. It's the basis of all good literature. We are flawed and we make our way through the world. It's interesting that some schools in India use Churchill quotes to sell themselves about courage, and I do wonder how real that is. Let's move on to the next slide, because that's, I think, what we bring to our view of history and of the world. And this is us, our baggage, our bias, and our belief. What do we bring to the table? And I want you to start thinking as TOK students or as teachers working with TOK students, where your brain's operating system comes from. So this is the default way that you look at and view the world. What influences have you had? Do you understand that the things you like and don't like are just your preferences, but they are your biases as well? And I suppose that as TOK students, we need to stop thinking about the idea of being right. And we need to understand that through a simple accident of birth, we are where we find ourselves with these parents in this place with its culture and its history. But if it wasn't for this accident of birth, I would be somebody else, somewhere else, seeing the world in a particular way. And that background and language and culture and all of the experiences that it brings is what's actually shaped us and shaped the way that we see, that we hear, that we think about the people we're interacting with and about what we're learning. So we're not just studying things, we are studying, reflecting on ourselves and what we bring. And understand what's highlighted there at the bottom of the slide. The differences between us are a resource, not a complication. Now, it's hard to do it online with 30 or 40 people, but in your TOK classroom, it's discussing these differences. It's sharing ideas and inviting them to be challenged that is going to make TOK interesting. And I encourage you to get into the habit of doing that, not just in writing, but spoken as well, because that's the way that you are going to keep learning more from other people. Yeah. You don't have every experience in the world. That person has an experience that you don't have. What can you learn from them? That's the way that you need to think as a TOK student. But remember, you're a TOK student in all of your subjects. So when you're doing your language and literature and you're reading a novel, you need to be thinking about the characters in that novel, the backgrounds that they have, what they are bringing to the story through them as a character. You need to be thinking in your science classes about what you're being asked to experiment on. Has that experiment been done before? Probably. So why are you doing it? What is it that you're building in terms of practice and understanding when you repeat experiments? What are you contributing to when you're acquiring data? And what are you learning when you're analyzing that data in order to come up with a result on which you can base a conclusion? We have developed these systems of knowledge that we are going to use in order to become better knowers. And better doesn't mean right. It means we understand the limits of our knowledge. Now, the next thing that is worth mentioning is our TOK concept. So this is the third element of TOK. We've got our areas of knowledge, we've got our themes, and us as a knower is the key theme. And then we have these concepts. Now, what are these about? Single words, and these words come up in almost all of your subject areas. So evidence comes up in your sciences, in your human sciences, it comes up in history. Your literature teacher will ask you to look for evidence in the text to support the ideas that you have. Certainty. To what extent do you know that that's right? Again, your sciences, your certainty is limited by the fact that you don't know what the answer is. You're just approaching a better answer. Objectivity. Are you understanding the different perspectives that people might have? Values. What do I think about with the word values in TOK? Well, I might think about ethics. I might think about what's right to do. I might think that I don't like the sound of this medical stuff that tests on animals. I became a vegetarian because I don't like the way that animals are treated. And I believe that they're as valuable as me and I don't want to be eaten. Values have an impact on what we're prepared to do in order to acquire knowledge. And then culture. Do I understand where that person or where that idea is coming from? Do I understand the depth of understanding and traditions and arts that come in this particular field? So these words they're reminders. They're reminders of things that I need to think about as a TOK student whenever I'm responding to something. So if I'm invited to do my TOK exhibition and I've got 35 different short sentences or prompts that I need to respond to, I need to think about which one of these concepts or which two of these concepts would be really good to talk about, given that particular prompt. When it comes to the TOK essay at the end of DP2, again, these are reminders to me to think about things a little more deeply. Which of these things do I need to look at more carefully if I'm answering a question about why science has proved so good at creating knowledge? Well, I might talk about evidence. I might talk about objectivity, and I might talk about explanation as the concepts to help myself be more clear in describing what science does. Yeah. So these are the TOK concepts. And again, I'm going to just give you a little task to help us think about how we might put these to use. So the question is, do I trust my sources? The picture here is the front page of a newspaper. It could have been from anywhere, but I took it from a newspaper called The Sun, which is a paper in the United Kingdom. And I chose it because there's not too much on the front page. You can be absolutely inundated sometimes with information, but I want you to have a look at this front page. And I want you to think about the news perhaps that you read. I want you to think about the information that you're given from the media that you consume. And then I want you to look at this front page and think about what it is that you're seeing here What's happening on this front page? Take a minute, and I want you to think not just about what's happening, but what questions do you have, and maybe tie that up to some of those concepts. So let's take a minute, put anything in the chat if you want to, and then in a moment, I'll ask people to unmute themselves if they want to share an idea, and we can have a conversation about what we're looking at here. So a couple of people have shared something. We're looking at ideas of evidence and truth. We'll talk about some of that in a moment. Newspapers are a secondary source of obtaining information. We can't trust content blindly. We should take precautions. Right. We'll talk about what some of those precautions might be. Does anyone want to share some of the things that they're thinking? You can unmute yourself and add to the conversation.
I would like to say something.
Please, Signa.
So I was looking at the migrant street label that they put on it, and they mentioned that there were 83 asylum seekers. But first thing is that we do not know where they got the information from. Like, where are they telling that they got us 83? And even if we assume that there are 83 asylum seekers, maybe there are more people, like let's say there's like 1,000 or maybe 500 people already living there who are locals. How can we suddenly, because only a fifth a new additions being added to the 500. So we can't really label it a migrant street anymore. It's still just a normal community. And also they mentioned that there'll be pressure from like the locals, like on the locals because on like goods and whatnot, which is fine, but we do not again have any concrete claims or like evidence that this would really end up like pressuring them. Maybe there's enough resources there to support a larger community in the first place.
Absolutely. I like the way you think, Snigdha. Um, the words migrant street are the biggest words on this front page, aren't they? They're bigger than the title of the newspaper. And they're designed to get a reaction too. And what kind of reaction are they aiming for at the moment? They're under something that says Sun investigation. They've chosen the word investigation. The Sun is a tabloid newspaper. It is not the kind of investigative journalism that the Guardian or the New York Times or the Age newspaper in Australia engage in. 83, you're right. Where did that come from? I just checked to see how many, for example, how many new houses were built in that region. Because if you zoom in, you can actually read where it was. There were between 2,300 and 2,600 new homes built in that region in the last 18 months. So 83 is really not very many. The average house price in that region is 290,000 pounds. So these are lower than average houses in a sense as well. It does make you wonder what message is being put forward. Now, do you know who owns the Sun newspaper? Is this a newspaper that has a political interest in aggravating certain sections of society? Well, it's owned by a guy called Rupert Murdoch. He and his Murdoch News organization own newspapers and Sky News. They own news TV channels all over the world. He lives in New York. He's Australian. He's a migrant, isn't he? And yet the point here is to try and aggravate negative feelings towards some types of migrants, asylum seekers, perhaps. Although at the moment, asylum seekers could be the people who were working for the British and American governments in Afghanistan before they just walked out of that country and are actually in danger if they stay anywhere near where they grew up. So, isn't there a moral responsibility to help certain people in the world? So, yeah, these are the complicated questions to ask and to think about when reading or seeing anything that's being put forward. It also tells you, if you look at the detail there, it says you can read the full story on page 7. However, you can read more about England's World Cup team on pages 4 and 5, which would suggest that that's probably more important to the reader of The Sun. Again, what kind of investigative journalism are we actually getting here? Yeah. So big questions to ask. Now, just look, here we go. Just looking at the time, let's close by saying that all of these ideas, these ways of thinking, these questions to ask are going to be important in TOK. And how do they get put to the test? Well, here's how. During the course, I've got two pieces of assessment. The exhibition is a 950 word response in 3 objects to one of 35 prompts. You will be given 35 sentences or prompts, and you will be invited to share what you think as a result of reading one of these. Yeah. And this gets done in the first year of the course in DP1, normally at the end, normally in May or June, and 33% of your marks are gained from this. And all you have to do here is choose 3 objects and justify your choice. Why do you think of these 3 objects when you read that prompt? And how are those objects related to the prompt? You have to explain yourself. So it's a job of clearly articulating your thought process. There's no right, there's no wrong, but you can't choose an object that somebody else has already chosen in your class. You know, you can choose an object that someone's chosen in the world, and the object has to be a specific object to you. So it can't be a ruler, but it can be the ruler that you used to measure your foot and discover that a foot is not a foot long. That's interesting. So that's the first piece of assessment. The second piece of assessment is the essay. And the essay is in response to one of 6 titles that you will be given in DP2. And the 6 titles will give you the chance to talk about at least one thing that you find interesting and you enjoy in your DP program. They're usually related to 1 or 2 of the areas of knowledge, and they usually give you the chance to talk about one of the themes in quite a deep way, 1,600 words, and you get the chance to get written feedback from your teacher. And of course, you'll be using perhaps an AI assistant along the way to help you think not about what content you put in, but how you're going to create your content, what questions you ought to be answering, and what different perspectives might exist on this topic that you should cover in your essay. And once you've done those 2 things, you can usually sit back in March. Most schools have March as their internal deadline for this. And that gives you enough time to concentrate on the rest of your subjects before your exams. There we go. Vrinda, I will end our session there, if that's all right. If there are any questions that people have, if there's anything that you would like to ask or share before we go, then please unmute yourselves and let's spend a few minutes having a conversation.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So in the essay or even in the exhibition prompt that we write, do we have to like reference the journals, like secondary sources as well, or can we just write it only based on our thinking?
So when it comes to the exhibition, you can really do it just based on your experience and your thinking, because what you're trying to do is justify why I have put this object in this exhibition. Some of my students this year had a list of sources and some of them did not. And it doesn't matter. There is no element of the assessment criteria that relates to sources. But when it comes to the essay, if you are going to quote people, which you just don't do in the exhibition, really, if you're going to quote ideas, if you're going to cite your research, then yes, you are going to list that in a bibliography of sources. And so long as you do that in a consistent way, it doesn't matter which way, whether you use MLA format or some other format, it just doesn't matter. You just have to be consistent.
Okay.
I have a question as well.
Please.
So when I was looking through the rubric for the exhibition, the TOK exhibition, a strong point that I noted was the justification element. And I think the more I think about it, there's this paradox-ish confusion that I have, where justification is largely subjective, especially in the TOK.
Mhm.
And I think the main question in it all is how exactly would personal justification be graded? Or is there a particular way that we're expected to justify a given object and relate it to the prompt? Or is there a clear guideline as to how that would be better done?
So, right, if you look at that, if you look at the rubric, right at the bottom, you've got a collection of words, haven't you?
Yeah,
Which
yeah.
is the sort of global impression marking words. And one of the best things that you can be is convincing, and one of the worst things you can be is descriptive. So what
Mm,
you're aiming to do when you justify, and a justification sentence is where you use the word because in it, and then say why you're putting that object there. If you can be convincing, and if what
right.
you say, if what you're writing makes sense, then you have done the job. You don't have to be correct. You don't have to be right. You just have to be convincing in
Mm,
sharing your justification. Yeah.
I'm sorry, just to clarify, when we're saying being convincing, isn't convincing often done through evidence, and evidence here is subjective, right? So,
Well, is evidence subjective? I think that you can put a decent case for why the evidence that you have chosen for this
hmm,
object makes sense. That's the job. Yeah. And
okay,
if what you're writing is coherent, if it's reasonable, if it's sensible, it's going to be fine. Yeah.
okay, yeah. Thank you
And
so
again,
much.
it's you've chosen a specific object.
Yeah,
And I think
yes,
that students can do very well in choosing objects that have a particular meaning to them, and and also allow you to talk about yourself as a knower. I think
okay,
that's where you do really well.
okay,
Yeah.
yes, I'll keep that in mind. Thank you.
Does anybody else have any question?
Okay.
All
Well, if
right.
there's nothing else, remember that your Sparkle team is there to support you as you go through your DP program. All of the teachers in all of the subjects have an understanding of TOK and the connection between TOK and that subject area. And they'll be in a position to help you if you want to have a conversation about this prompt or this idea that you're thinking of for your essay, and you're not quite sure about how you're going to make that work in the area of knowledge or subject area. There'll be a good conversation for you there. Okay. Well, thanks everybody for giving your time on a Saturday evening to think a little bit about TOK. I wish you all the very best. It's an enjoyable course, and it's all the better if you participate. Take care.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you so much.
Bye bye. Bye, Vrinda. Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.